Welcome to our next talk, titled Morphing Magi, the LOC Menologium in Dialogue with 17th Century Depictions of the Adoration of the Magi. My name is Hachik Muradian, and I am the Armenian Georgian Area Specialist at the Library of Congress. And today I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Whitney Kite. Whitney is a PhD candidate at Columbia University, where she specializes in Armenian art and architecture. Her dissertation explores the connections between medieval Armenian monasteries and their local topography. Her master's thesis, The Madonna's Magic Carpet, the Construction of Presence in Armenian Tympanum Relief, received the 2020 Graduate Student Essay Award by the International Center of Medieval Art. Prior to her doctoral work, Whitney received an MA in Art History from Tufts University and a BA in Biological Anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania. Her research has been generously supported by the Medieval Academy of America, the National Association of Armenian Studies and Research, the Claudia Rattazzi Papka Memorial Fund, the Dr. Paula Gerson Fund, Casa Muraro, the Armenian General Benevolent Union, and the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. Whitney, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Hachik, for that very nice introduction. Let me bring up my slides. Today I will be discussing an artifact of Armenian religious practice, a manuscript housed in the Library of Congress collection. I will begin with a general discussion of the manuscript, its origin and contents, and then move on to a more detailed discussion of the image of the Adoration of the Magi included in the manuscript. My time as a Lilly resident scholar at the library was spent exploring this beautiful fragment of an Armenian manuscript. This manuscript is a Menologium, or a Heismavork in Armenian, which is a liturgical book organized into the months with passages commemorating saints on their respective feast days throughout the year. The 6 pages of the Menologium, seen here, are just fragments of a much larger manuscript whose whereabouts remain unknown. These fragments consist of 2 incipit pages, seen here, 2 full-page illuminations here, which are gilded illustrations, and 2 pages of textual content with marginal illustrations. Since the library acquired the manuscript in the early 20th century, its origin has remained unknown. However, a 17th century date was assigned to the manuscript based on stylistic analysis. To confirm the 17th century date assigned to the manuscript, I tried to find images with similar style and compositional arrangements. After scrolling through hundreds of manuscripts, I found this incipit page in the catalog of the Chester Beatty collection in Dublin. The general layout of the page, including a small passage over the main text, which you can see here, a large ornamental initial followed by ornithographic letters or bird letters, 2 rows of majuscule or capital letters in 2 different colors, and then the standard text very much closely matched those in the Library of Congress Menologium. Furthermore, the ornamentation on the sides of the pages and the headpieces are also done in a similar style. Originally, I only had a black and white image to work with, but their collection specialist, Jill Uncle, was kind enough to send me this color image, which just enhances the similarities between these 3 pages. In the marginal ornament here, you can see the same use of the blue with white dots in both manuscripts, small pink flowers, and a gold background. And the headpieces, you can see the same orange on the bottoms, which fades to pink on the top, and the same like minuscule little curves in white with little dots, and these 3 pronged things used to convey depth of the frame, as if this were really like a 3-dimensional frame, and that's used the same in both. The large initial letters were the most striking to me, as this vine motif used in both really doesn't exist in much of Armenian manuscript painting. And so the fact that this is used in these 2 manuscripts, to me, suggested that these were either produced in the same workshop, or even that one might be a copy of the other. However, based on the contents of the manuscript that we have at the Library of Congress, this page from Dublin, now in the middle, actually fills a void in the existing pages. Here, these three incipit pages, which mark the three main divisions of the Menologium. Here I've placed them in order. So we have Navasard 1, which corresponds to August 11th, the first day in the Armenian calendar. The Dublin page is Calouste 29, or January 6th, which is the Nativity and the Epiphany together. And on the end, we have RX 16, which is Easter and the Resurrection. From the description in the Chester Beatty catalog, I also learned that the scribe of this previous page in the middle, his son was also a manuscript artist, and he copied his father's designs in his own manuscripts. So again, at the help of their collection specialist, Jill Uncle, I was able to get a copy of this page of a Menologium produced by the son of the original artist, which really is a copy of the one at the Library of Congress. So I think this further solidifies that this earlier page here, that these are really all from the same manuscript. To even further confirm this stylistic analysis, I was able to find the sales report from 1909, which is about the sale of this manuscript. It was sold in Paris by a Mr. Inju John. And in this report, it includes images of all three incipit pages together, really confirming that these are in fact from the same manuscript. The report put together in the early 20th century also contains a lot of helpful information about what the full manuscript was like before it was taken apart. It was enormous, which is pretty cool. It was 41 by 30 centimeters. So this is a large manuscript, and it had 587 folios. We only have 7 of those now. So there are 580 more pages of this manuscript out there somewhere. The sales report also included the information from the colophon, which is a dedicatory inscription at the end of a manuscript. And so this is no longer in either the Library of Congress or the Dublin collection, but it was recorded in the sales report, so we can know now a little bit more about the manuscript. It was produced in Eutokia, which is modern day Tokat in Turkey, in the Church of St. Barsum. We know the name of the scribe, which is Mokhortum, from Shosh, which is near New Jolfa, Isfahan in Iran. We know when it was made. It was in 1132 of the Armenian era, which is 1683 by our modern calendar, which also confirms that 17th century date that was provided based on stylistic analysis. And we also know the names of the patrons, which is pretty cool. And so they were 3 brothers, Hovhannes, Balthazar, and Nina Smatitsi. To reiterate, this manuscript was really a luxury purchase. This is 587 folios, it's a lot of pages, and 366 of them were illuminated. So again, had gold foil used on them. Those include the 3 incipit pages that I've shown before and the 2 full page illuminations, but this also includes 12 frontispieces marking each of the months, 12 images of saints, much larger than those marginal illustrations, and 207 marginal illustrations, again, with gold leaf. Again, we don't know where most of these are, unfortunately, but hopefully by this talk and having rediscovered some of this, in the future, maybe more of these will show up. It's worth noting that the pages that we do know about, the ones in the Library of Congress and in Dublin, these are the most valuable pages from the manuscript. These contain the most gold, these illuminations have the most artistic value, and so what we're really looking at is a manuscript that was taken apart and the most valuable pages resold on the art market. So that's why we have these here. It's also worth noting that even these small illuminations, which again they're small for the manuscript, but because itself is 1.5 feet tall, these are still, sizable illustrations with gold leaf. And these are also 2 very important days in the Christian calendar. We have the Dormition of the Virgin over here, which is the death of the Virgin Mary. It's one of the most important days of the year to celebrate her. And we have St. Gregory the Illuminator, who's the patron saint of Armenia, on the right, and his name is also outlined in gold in the text itself. These full page illuminations are the biggest, they have the most gold, and they are the most striking images in the manuscript. So the rest of the talk will focus on these 2. To reiterate, there's only 2 of these in the whole manuscript, not only that we have now, but even originally, these were the only 2 full page images included in the whole book. And while it's common for illustrated manuscripts to have multiples of these. It's interesting that this one only has these two, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. These do align with the incipit pages, so these main divisions of the manuscript. We have Calouste 29, which is the birth and theophany of Christ. This is Christmas, essentially. And so this image corresponds to that. And then on this side, we have RX 16, so Easter, and we have the resurrection of Christ corresponding to this division of the manuscript. Again, to look at these a little more closely, over here on the left, we have the resurrection of Christ. This is, again, one of the most important feasts in the Christian calendar. In this image, Christ rises above his tomb, whose pink lid lands askew as if thrown off by his sudden ascent. Billowing clouds part around Christ, whose gold-lined purple cape catches the wind. His pose is dynamic. His arms are, really spread wide in this active stance. And below, two angels look on solemnly onto the scene, seemingly humbled by his presence. On the right, we have the adoration of the Magi. We have a tiny infant Christ, which sits on Mary's lap, and three Magi approaching with golden offerings. The Magus in the foreground has removed his crown, which you can still see down here, as he kneels before this newborn king. All of the Magi wear brightly colored fur-lined cloaks, and Mary's garment echoes the pattern of Christ's purple and gold cloak over here. In the background, Joseph looks onto the scene, and his pose mimics that of the angels in the resurrection. Well, to our modern eyes, these figures may look a little wonky at first. Let's go back here, actually. Examination really shows, both of these images are high quality productions. They feature a heavy use of gold leaf. I know it's a little hard to tell, but all of this in the background of Christ is done in gold, as well as the space between the mountains in the adoration. These also feature incredibly rich pigments, this deep purple used for the clothes of Christ and Mary. This would take a lot of raw pigment to create such a rich color, which again adds to the expense. And again, this is a huge manuscript, just to really reiterate that. So this is really on the scale of, say, a panel painting or an icon more than a small portable book. These also demonstrate the knowledge of the artist, not only of his own time, but of his historical tradition that he's working in. These images feature both elements from Armenian medieval manuscript production, but also elements of contemporary European images, which were coming into the Armenian world around the 17th century. To show that here, Mary's garment with this gold line called Crystography. This really comes out of 13th century Armenian manuscript illumination, which you can see in these images of Mary from two Gospels from the 13th century. This is also found in contemporary Italian painting from the 13th century, say like Duccio or Cimabue. But again, this is really a medieval style to have this kind of gold lined garment, and especially Mary with the blue and the purple together, as we see here. The resurrection also brings in some elements of medieval painting. This is, again, the Queen Quran Gospels, which we saw on the last slide. And the same pink marbling on the slab of Christ's tomb is used in both, and this gold background is really found in both images as well. However, a much more close comparison can be found in the 17th century woodcuts coming out of Western Europe. Here we see the Oscan Bible, which is also in the Library of Congress collection. And this was the first printed Armenian Bible. It was completed in Amsterdam in 1666. And it does have Armenian text, which you can see here for the text of the Bible, but these woodcuts used to illustrate it are not Armenian. Instead, they're from a local Amsterdam artist called Christophe van Siechem. But nonetheless, these printed books with these European images circulated widely in the Armenian world and perhaps could have been seen by the artist of the Menologium. Again, they circulated quite widely, and by the 17th century, not just in this Menologium, but in many other Armenian images as well, we see the same motif of Christ rising between these blue billowing clouds with a gold background and this kind of wind-blown cape and a staff. This composition really occurs over and over in the 17th century. Another route that this could have taken to get into this particular manuscript is through the church in New Jolfa. Again, the artist of the Menologium signs it as Mahartum from Shosh, which is near New Jolfa. So he originated there, even if he produced the manuscript in Tokat. And as you can see on the church here, this really comes out of the Armenian diaspora in New Jolfa in the 17th century. They were forcibly moved there in 1603 by Shah Abbas. It was a large community of 300,000 Armenians, but after they moved, they were given trade privileges. And so they really amassed wealth quite quickly. And they also amassed these trade relationships between Persia and Western Europe. So with this increased trade and increased wealth, when these new diaspora community wanted to build a church for their new home, they built it in a Western European style for the decoration. So images like this really come out of this woodcut tradition that we saw from the prints. But this could also be an image that our artist saw directly and then chose to recall that when he had produced this manuscript after he moved from Jolfa. The Magi image, which I find very interesting, it's a little bit more difficult to trace in terms of its composition and where this comes from. Here I have it juxtaposed with the earliest illustration of the Magi in an Armenian context that we know of. This also happens to be from the earliest collection of Armenian manuscript illuminations. It's the Etchmiadzin Gospels, which is a 6th century book. Again, one of the earliest scenes, and we already have the Magi in it. I should also note these pages were produced 1,000 years apart, so it's understandable there would be some differences, but it still differs from medieval depictions, as I will show. From the earliest image, this image in the Etchmiadzin Gospels, the Magi are depicted as Persian priest kings, which are known as Magi. So it's really using the real meaning of this word in the illustration of these figures. The identity of the Magi as Persian priest kings also comes from the Armenian infancy gospel, so not just the Bible, but also this apocryphal text, which informs much of Armenian religious imagery. In this text, which I also have on the screen, the Magian kings are described as brothers from a distant land, from Persia, but who each ruled their own lands. Melkon was the king of Persia, Gaspar was king of India, and Balthazar was king of the Arabians. Yet, despite their different kingdoms, the Persian heritage of the Magi is emphasized in their clothing, and their brotherhood really ties them together. Over time, the Magi shift to become a joint image with the Nativity, especially in this kind of middle 12th, 13th century medieval period in Armenian art. And this makes sense because the Nativity and the Epiphany are celebrated jointly in the Armenian church. So having one image with both is a logical conclusion. However, the clothing of the Magi does also change over time. As Armenians encountered new people through migration or the Crusades, the attire of the Magi changes to match these new people that they were encountering. Sometimes they're given free pointed crowns like you might associate with Western European royalty. And other times they're wearing turbans with red or gold caps, perhaps reflecting a change in contemporary Persian headwear. Across time, however, all three Magi are consistently depicted wearing the same style of garment and headgear, again, emphasizing this brotherhood and kinship between the three kings, rather than these distant lands that they were ruling over. In the 17th century, however, we do see a change. So up until this point, they've all been depicted wearing the same clothing as brothers, but here we start to see a differentiation. Especially in images coming out of Constantinople, we see a formal distinction between these three kings. Sometimes more than one of them will wear a European crown, as you see Here, sometimes they'll all have three different clothing, but at this point, you also often see a turbaned king, usually wearing a pointed crown on top of his large white turban. Constantinople too is where we see the closest parallels in terms of composition for the scene. So again, this doesn't look a lot like those medieval images we saw earlier. Instead, we have Joseph standing behind Mary and Christ on the left of the image, and those two are shown in profile. They face the Magi, who approach from the right, and the Magi are then processing in age order, with the eldest first, and usually the turbaned Magi last. And this is seen in nearly every example from Constantinople in this time. Again, this comes out of a European tradition. This is not a perfect parallel, but this woodcut by Albrecht Dürer from the 16th century shows, again, Mary and Christ in profile facing the Magi, and the turbaned Magi approaching last. However, this turbaned Magi may have his own origin story. In more woodcuts and engravings that are circulating in this time, there was a big desire to show the Magi in different ways in early modern Europe. And we see here different ways that you can depict the Magi with these different turban styles. Particularly this white turban with a crown. This became one way to signify an Ottoman ruler in particular, and sometimes even the Sultan himself. As seen in these portraits of various Ottoman rulers, the crown turban can take many forms, but its ubiquitous use in Western depictions, it's almost always used to signify an Ottoman ruler. While there's no evidence of any Ottoman rulers or rulers of any place wearing a turban with a crown on top, this kind of hybrid headwear signaled to a Western European audience both that the ruler was Ottoman in origin through his turban, but also that he was on par with a Western king, hence the crown. Another origin for this comes out of the 15th century with this portrait of Mehmed II by the Italian artist Gentile Bellini. This image, which is originally a painting, was circulated widely in the form of this medal, which you can see at the top of the screen. And this really made the combination of this large turban and the crown really significant and symbolic for the Sultan and Mehmed II in particular. So, returning to our image, if you remember, the New Jolfa Church really served as a strong source of imagery for the resurrection in this Library of Congress Menologium. However, when we look at the Magi scene from that church, there's not as close of a parallel. This looks a lot like that image from Dürer, but we don't see a turban on the Magus. Instead, we can think, this artist started in New Jolfa where he could have seen these images, but he moved to Tokat, which is in the Ottoman Empire. So now living in the Ottoman Empire, it might be a more poignant image if one of the Magi really has this headwear that signifies an Ottoman sultan as opposed to more Western European attire. Considering the manuscript as a whole, I'm also still puzzled why this inclusion of the adoration of the Magi is in the manuscript as opposed to the nativity or a joint image, because again, this corresponds to that incipit page for Christmas, but it's only the Magi that are included. So here I'd like to return to the colophon. I mentioned earlier that dedicatory inscription at the end of the manuscript. And that mentioned the three patrons, which are brothers, and they're named Epiphanes, Balthazar, and Minas. While Epiphanes and Minas have been popular Armenian names for centuries, millennia even, Balthazar, the name of the third Magus, and also the name of our patron, is a less common name. In the 17th century, as the Magi became more popular in European visual culture, this name also became more popular in Amsterdam. As you recall, Amsterdam was also likely the origin for those woodcuts and other compositions borrowed by the artist in his illustrations. As Armenians increased their mercantile presence in Amsterdam, the cultural exchange that brought new images to Armenia also brought these new names, like Balthazar. Returning to this image directly, perhaps the patron, Balthazar, felt a particular affinity for the Magi given his namesake. Or if we recall the specific Armenian story of the Magi from that Armenian infancy gospel, three brothers come from Persia and present golden gifts to Christ. So perhaps we can see this image as a portrait of these three brothers, and in turn, this whole manuscript as their golden gift. Thank you.
Perhaps it would be great to sort of complete the journey by talking about how the manuscript came to be sold in the early 20th century. Can you please address that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this comes out of the sales report that was produced by Mr. Maclair in 1909. So he recounts that Mr. Inju John, who sold this manuscript, he purchased the manuscript in 1896 in Sivas. And Sivas is a town in Turkey not too far from Tokat, where this manuscript was produced. He says that he purchased it from the bishop of Sivas, who was selling these manuscripts, not only from there, but from all of the churches in his reign. And he was using the proceeds to set up orphanages. There were unfortunately, a lot of orphan children in the late 19th century that their parents were victims of the early genocide. So he was trying to set up a fund for these poor kids. It's also along the same lines. It's important to note that this bishop is the Bishop of Sivas, and in the colophon, it's mentioned that this manuscript was produced under the Bishop of Sivas. So it was kept in the same area, probably the same church, all the way up until the genocide. And so not only were these poor people victims of the genocide, but really this manuscript is too, because then it was taken apart and sold and not kept in the same place anymore.
Yeah, and especially the fact that there are so many pages of it that we don't really know where they ended up. How about if you can talk a little bit more about the resurrection scene? The Magi are my favorite as well. The resurrection scene is also perhaps one of the most outstanding manuscript thieves that we have at the library. So if you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Here we go. Yeah, so like you said, the scene is, again, one of the more beautiful, large, gilded, impressive illuminations at the Library of Congress. And, really out of 17th century Armenian art, this is a huge, beautiful manuscript. And I'm sorry I couldn't talk more about the resurrection in the talk. But it is a really interesting scene. So as we saw in a lot of its comparison images, this motif with the clouds billowing makes sense, and it's in all of these scenes. But the two angels on the side, I think, are really fascinating. There are no soldiers in the scene. And if you think about, Christ rising from the tomb and the women coming to the tomb, as you see here, the soldiers are asleep, and that's presumably when he, sneaks out. And they're a really important part of the story, and they're included in all of these other images in contemporary illustrations and in this image here, but here they're replaced by angels. And I don't have a good reason why, but I do think that's a really interesting swap to take these kind of sinning Roman soldiers who weren't guarding the tomb properly and replace them by these really holy angels. It's really interesting. I was also super confused by these like wavy T shapes in the background. But after I found this image, you can see there are these tall crosses receding to the horizon there. And so these make a bit more sense after looking at this image, and they don't occur in the others. Another reason why perhaps this is a good source image for this.
Thank you. It was also a little bit, I was relieved to see that little damage at the bottom of the resurrection was in fact present in the earlier images from the early 20th century, right, 1909. So it was not damage that the manuscript had suffered, in recent decades. Thank you again for this tremendous journey, Whitney. Would you like to share a little bit more on your current research, your dissertation research, which also happens to, tackle, in this particular case, Armenian churches and monasteries?
Yeah, of course. So I am a specialist in Armenian art, but usually I work on architecture. So this is actually a really fun chance to be at the library and work with manuscripts in a more close capacity, because my dissertation is on architecture and landscape and these much more larger ideas instead of really diving into these smaller handheld objects. As you mentioned briefly at the beginning, my dissertation explores the connection between medieval Armenian monuments, monasteries, and their local landscapes. I'm really interested in how the natural topography is shaping both the shape of these sites, but also their function and how they relate to their local communities. I'm focusing on mainly 3 case studies. Others will show up, but mostly Gerhard and Tatev, which are both in the modern Republic of Armenia, and then also Horamos, which is in modern day Eastern Turkey, right outside the medieval city of Ani. And that was, a royal monastery, which is pretty exciting, but hasn't unfortunately not been worked on that much. Often like these other victims of, being in Eastern Turkey, they're just lesser known and harder to access.
Thank you. One of the aspects that I was thinking, one of the issues that I was thinking about during your presentation was how, in many ways, your presentation demonstrates the ways in which the Armenian church and Armenian culture and heritage is situated within a broader context. And so it is particularly, we very much appreciate the fact that you decide to research these particular illuminations, because at the Library of Congress, and specifically at where they are housed at the African and Middle Eastern Division, and in that context, again, we very much appreciate the fact that you offered that kind of broader insight into the place of this manuscript and the influences, the many influences that actually appear and are reflected there. Thank you again for joining us at the Library of Congress to conduct your research. And thank you for this wonderful presentation. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you for having me.